Herzinger has this argument, right, where he says, look, civilization is fundamentally about playing games. And I give this example of this one cartel boss killing his brother. But he kills him, he invites him to the local cockfight. And while the cockfight is happening, the one brother kills the other brother. Well, why? I mean, why not just go to his house and kill him? No, it's got to be done at the cock ring, right? Because there's a whole symbolic play, power is being reestablished, and I need to be able to communicate to the people watching the cockfight that I have just killed my brother, so now I'm the cock of the walk, right? So this is a very Herzinger idea, right? That all social organization follows the structure of games, and then what's important about that, games always have rules.
Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Graham McAleer, professor of philosophy at Loyola University Marymount. And we're talking about his book, Security Ethics, Commerce and Crime in a Polycentric World. Dr. McAleer, wonderful to have you on today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me back. It's great.
So first question, Dr. McAleer, why this book?
So, Loyola has a quite a well-appreciated, nationally appreciated forensic science program. And because we're a liberal arts college, they always want to, even when they're doing something like, a science program, they want it to be embedded in the humanities in some way. So I was approached to offer some electives for the forensic studies science people. And so I thought, okay, well, let me do something on philosophy and crime. And then you got to think, well, wait a minute, given the competition with real crime podcasts and stuff like that, it's a pretty tall ask, right? And then I thought, well, we live in a commercial civilization, and so maybe we could look at the role of sort of organized crime. And then when you look at the role of organized crime, you start to see it has all these sort of geopolitical implications. The organized crime is not merely people on the margins of societies trying to make a bit of money. I mean, there are major players. They infiltrate governments. They collaborate and cooperate with governments. They engage in joint projects. There's quite a lot to this, right? So I thought, this could be quite an interesting, way of sort of helping the students to think about the place of crime. And then the idea was to link up with some philosophers who could speak to certain, critical issues in the sort of the criminal world, right? And primarily, you then want to think about, well, what is the crime doing to the sort of the populace, right? And so sometimes, you have problems of self-defense leagues fighting cartels. Sometimes it's big institutional players like, big oil fighting back, sort of like environmental, some call it terrorism, others call it some kind of environmental liberation. But, there are different ways of like looking at this. And it's a really like super expansive, it's not hard to write about actually, right? Because there's so much material.
Yeah. And I was surprised. It's a world that I haven't seen a lot of philosophical literature on, which is something you talk about. And yet it's such a big and broad, fertile world. Like there's so much, like, I love it. Like really you go through just lots of topics that could all be their own book. And I love that approach. I love giving people that kind of expansive vista. And I want to ask you about the dead hand of competence. I love that phrase, but this book is a starting point, not like a final word on the subject in any way.
Right. So I think one reason it's not especially dealt with is because we have such a state-centric bias, especially, Look, I mean, most academic scholarship is done in the United States. right? The United States university system is huge. It is the sort of the Godzilla of the intellectual world, right? And of course, for Americans, well, Uncle Sam is in charge. And lest you doubt that, well, you just try and go up against, and you will find out, yeah, Uncle Sam is in charge. But actually, throughout much of the world, the state isn't in charge. There are people who live in all sorts of marginal, self-regulating communities, right? Yeah, I mean, you have only to look at places. Obviously, somewhere like contemporary Syria, is a really graphic example of what happens when the central state collapses. But not to over, but if you think about, well, under what government do the Gazans live? Like, what's that exactly, right? I mean, you can just go through the world and find all sorts of places where the state is not a principal operator of order. So then what is? Well, sometimes it's corporations and sometimes it's organized crime. So I think there hasn't been a lot of sort of philosophical reflection on this, I think, quite an interesting avenue into the problem of order, just because we are so state centric. We are so used to the presence of the state. Um, so that's kind of one thing I would say about it. Um, and then the other thing is that there is, and I tried to do that at the start of the book, right? There is this sort of area in the academic world of security studies, and sometimes this deals indeed with the relationship between states, but very often there are quite a lot of people working on, things like, how is it that borders figure in the imagination? What is the role of a border? What is the role of a wall? Right, it's been a huge issue in American politics of recent years. So there are ways of thinking aesthetically, ethically, poetically about various things that we would think of as security,
Hmm.
uh, that actually are mm, sort of more peculiar, right? So just think about the way in which, like, a lot of computer games would have security motifs that actually, think about, for example, a contemporary airport, right? An airport is this really interesting thing, right? Because air travel, either for business or maybe for pleasure, family vacations, right? But actually, what you do is, of course, you step inside a rigorously controlled security zone where much of the modern world begins to cohere, right? Digitization, um, hard armor of the militaresque police forces, surveillance, everyone having sort of coded numbers on their passports. Um, when I come back to America, I'm not a citizen, right? So they do my biometrics. They have me look in the camera and they do a scan of the eye. Oh yeah, it's you, right? So, so just to say, right, that many ordinary encounters that we have with security can actually lead to these really deep and rich inquiries into um, things like play, right? So the coordination, say, between sort of computer games and computer imaging and military exercises, military training, right? Where you think about whether this is in the movies, right? You see these sort of people with GoPro cameras and or even now drone operators, who are essentially almost like computer games. So just to say, right, there's a whole design structure to this. There's an aesthetic structure, there's a moral structure, there's a dramatic structure. The book is, on the one hand, yeah, it's a little bit different because not a lot of people are focused on these sort of non-state actors in security, even though in many parts of the world they are the actors in security. And on the other hand, actually, it dovetails really well with a whole bunch of disciplines within the academy.
Yeah. A lot of different threads I can pull on there. I think the first one is you have three aims really with the book. You aim for, this is a book for leaders, for teachers, and for researchers. And you talked about forensic science, but also for leaders. I believe that you teach a large part of your teaching is business ethics. And of course, dealing with, you said you started this for forensic science, but also this seems to have a lot of implications for business ethics as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I used to teach in the Loyola's MBA program, and we used to have a lot of military officers who were coming out of, either they were coming out of the services um, and transitioning into business, or they themselves were sort of wanting business degrees by way of helping with the administration, even within the military, or huge in Maryland, defense contracting is
Makes
huge.
sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
So some of it came from that, that these characters were really quite interested in this, like, yeah, wait a minute, how does national security, the national security forces, dovetail with the private sector providers? Uh, and you see this especially now with various kinds of big data gathering. There's been a lot of stuff about this company called Palantir, which is one of the sort of Peter Thiel operations, and they're very involved in tracking populations, and that all feeds into what it is that the modern military wants to know about, right? So the the book begins with looking at just some of the ways that private industry fits with national security services, but then the book transitions to, wait, what happens when the national security services aren't involved at all?
Yeah.
And private industry is, in fact, the people providing the order and security. So I give some examples where um, local populations and NGOs twin with businesses because the business provides a center of stability, right? Businesses, whether you like big business or not, just sort of analytically, right? Big business is super organized. It can control a space.
Yeah.
It can afford its own security apparatus. It has the sort of intelligent means by which to deploy its influence. And so a lot of like local communities where there is very marginal national government turn to business, turn to these corporations for law and order. And for NGOs and various nonprofits, having a backstop of a big like mining corporation in a country acts as a kind of a force multiplier for the activity that they do. They can have their logistic services partly supplied by the corporation, and corporations are often quite happy to do this, right? Because it's always in the interest of business to have stability. And so, if they can force multiply their own stability by working with the NGOs to control the lands and peoples in and around their business, that's good for the business. So, you find these. So, one thing I wanted to look at was just what is this level of cooperation? We tend to think of business as super predatory, super rapacious, but actually, what are the levels of what Adam Smith would call like sympathy, right? These sort of like connections of sort of mutual interest and mutual feeling where you scratch my back, I scratch your back, where we can kind of all develop positively together here. That was sort of one of the things I wanted to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to give our audience a clue into just how big this is it the fourth largest company? Is it GS4? I get, if you don't mind, get like, I don't, unless you've watched, and even then, it just gives you a piece of the puzzle. Unless you watch a lot of war stuff and you hear about private military contractors, I don't think people realize how big it is and how powerful. Even as we talk about organized crime, even the way you talk about it in here, crime, we automatically think organized crime, that's negative. But in some cases, it can almost be positive because it's just order in an unordered space, right? And it's
Right.
we just have no idea. I mean, we talk about the cultural blindness. I do think of the state as having the monopoly on force. Like if
Yeah.
something bad's happening in my house, I'm going to call the
Sure.
police, right?
Right.
Like it's
Right. Right.
like,
Right.
and that's because I live in an ordered space.
Yeah.
But for most of the world, like the global South is not like that, and that's the polycentric, right?
Exactly.
In the subtitle. Um,
Yeah.
can you
Yeah.
talk a
Exactly.
little bit? And I want to make sure I'm getting. I think it's GS4 is the fourth largest company. Am I? Am
It's
I
the
gonna
third largest private employer in the world.
third largest private employer? Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So you've got people like Walmart.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got the various like Foxconn that makes our iPhones and what have you. And then it's this security provider, private
Yeah.
security provider, and they provide everything from collecting money from banks, staffing prisons, providing hospitals with security, to, as they love to euphemistically, kind of addressing complex situations, right? And that's
Like
when you
police actions, right? Like
right. And that's when you're bringing in, right, your retired special forces guys to come and do, you know, not off books work, but certainly be at the sort of the sharp end of certain, very compromised situations, right? And these companies, they do it all. And some of them you see are quite interesting, right? Like I talk a little bit about this one that works at the great kind of safari camps of Africa, because poaching, so like again, people in the West, we would think, oh my gosh, if someone shoots an elephant, I don't much care what happens to those people. They need to go down, right? Well, there are guys who you can pay who will more than happily join the local police forces as mercenaries essentially, and so people like the like the wildlife fund and people like this that we often give our charity to, right? Because we love animals and we think of the safari and right. But the fact is, there's a grim militaristic reality to controlling. Talk about a space that's unguarded. I mean, we're talking just thousands of square miles where there are poachers. And because although the ivory trade is not big in the West, it's enormous in the East. So there is a huge market for the poaching of these great animals. And environmental conservation companies have found that they need to supplement the local state with these kind of special forces characters. And you just go on their websites. Nothing's particularly hidden, right? You just go on their websites and see, and they're like, yeah, look, our guys come from here, there, and everywhere, and here's what we do, and we really do care about the environment as well. We're just the eco warrior, right?
yeah. I and something that's interesting to me about this, you mentioned liminal spaces with borders, but then you also have these kind of cultural liminal spaces. And that's kind of what we're talking about. A lot of times in the global South, you don't have a large controlled space because that takes infrastructure and money and power. But also, it's interesting how it shows up in the West with things like hospitals. So, what made me think of this, you're talking about the ivory trade being big in the East, and you got me reading The Red Market by is it Carney? And
Yeah,
I was
yeah,
expecting you talked about with hospitals, and he goes to find skeletons being used for hospitals, and instead he finds a different set of bone traders that he wasn't looking for, who were selling tibias for bone flutes to Buddhist monks. And this is where like the clash between cultures, and it's fascinating because they're so happy to live on the border of things, right?
yeah,
Uh,
right.
like literally, they're working on the side where making bone flutes is legal, and then they throw it over the fence like at the border, and then someone comes and picks it up. It's almost impossible to stop. Literally, like it's illegal on this side of the fence, and it's legal on this side of the fence, and the police officer's sitting there watching them work on the boats. It's
Yeah.
In America that just doesn't even. I mean, even in Britain, that really doesn't. You look at a lot of like what we talk about, like first world countries, and that's not Western
Right.
Europe. That hasn't been the case for a long time.
Right, right. Well, I give this one example, right, where this was a recent case in England where someone wanted a transplant and they brought the donor with them. But
Yes.
the doctors are like, there's something off about that. I just don't know if this donor is really doing this freely. And of course they weren't. So there is this whole sort of like new version of slavery that's connected with the transplant world. And again, super difficult to get that through a kind of a Western hospital because of all the protocols. But you go a little beyond the West, and everything is so much more fluid.
Yeah.
So, things like, the kind of the red markets, right? And then there's even these really gory stories about, the Russian-Ukraine war and the kind of a harvesting of organs from the recently killed soldiers and stuff like that. Now, whether this is a kind of a myth that's often created, I don't know, right? But certainly these markets exist. There's just so many court cases, when the sort of the sharks sort of the tip of the shark comes above the water and it gets into the court case record and you see what's going on. But so much of this stuff is underground. And again, this comes to organized crime, right?
Yes.
In something like the kind of the red market, right? There is such a desire for eternal life that if one is able to get your hands on some younger person's flesh that would extend your life, then there's going to be a business person who's ready to supply that desire that you have, right? Because that's the nature of the business world. They are all about supplying desires. And if that comes to red market stuff, bones, blood, organs, they'll supply it as well.
And I think this is, I mentioned it in passing, kind of the liminal space idea, but that's what's so fascinating. You make that you give a charge to hospitals because instead of being in geographical liminal space, they're at this liminal space between profit and the common good. And so they have to, and I'd never really thought of hospitals as like something that had to function as a guardian in that sense. Right. Yeah. There's always that problem, like, profit, but also healing people. And it's like, no, you're going to always be the target of a certain kind of criminal just by virtue of where you're sitting at, you call it the crossroads. I mean, you could think of that as like a border too between. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Or
Sure. Well, I think actually it's kind of interesting that in a lot of American hospital dramas, the problem between the profit motive, you always have the classic, right? It's always a trope, right? The heroic resident intern doctor fighting for the common good against the sleazy hospital manager who is like, no, we can't deal with that patient because it's going to cost down the road $3 million occupying that bed. We can't do that. Right. And then so you always have this sort of like angel and demon structure to these TV shows. So it's right there, that part of it, right? But then, so I gave this case, right, where the head of mortuary services at Harvard's medical school was just arrested for selling body parts. So this is Harvard. Their mortuary manager is busted by the feds for selling donated bodies to the market, So yeah, it's right there, right? Excuse the word, right? But the bleed into the criminal world, right? It's right there.
Props for that pun. Okay.
Yeah. Right. So So in other words, right, the moral, the sort of the three moments here, right? The common good, resident fighting for the common good, the profit motive of the company, and then people literally selling into the black market. So these are all great ethical domains about exactly what's going on here. And then what is the character of the hospital manager, right? I mean, it's so easy. We often think of sort of manager jobs are really boring, and but actually, there's something really quite noble about hospitals, right? They're very much at the front line of human dignity, or they ought to be. And I think a lot of complaints people have about the medical system is precisely that, right? Like, man, I was treated, my family was treated horribly here, right? I mean, this is a real black mark against the hospital. Um, so I wanted to unpack that a little bit about what do these, because these hospitals tend to be parts of huge conglomerations. Um, and although in America or the West, again, the hospital systems are very regulated, these companies are often investing in global South environments where that's not the case at all. And that's when you're likely to rub shoulders against these other principles of order, which, so again, is to your point, right? Of course, we are going to think of something like the Mexican cartels as just straightforwardly bad and evil, right? But actually, in a kind of a godfather system where they control, people find their accommodation within the cartel rule. And they look after their own, right? Because they're trying to be essentially sovereigns. Um, and it's a brutal kind of a rule, but it can be efficacious. And people, Albert Camus has this phrase, right, where he says humans get used to anything, right? And so, if you're living under a cartel, well, you're going to doff the cap. You're going to obey, and they would deliver order, and it wouldn't be the worst. You don't want to cross them, and it's going to be horrible. But just to say, right, that the reality of power, right? Again, we just so think of power as wedded to the kind of the public state, but the reality of power is quite varied. And then the interesting question is, what happens when these things kind of come into connection, and especially what happens when companies, right? Because companies are often the place where, because again, right, the Western world has most of the companies, and yet the Western world companies are out in all these different environments, right? So they're kind of the main ground zero about where this interesting link is going to happen. And so I wanted, on the question of the leaders, I wanted both military leaders and corporate leaders just to be thinking about, wait a minute, how do we finesse some of these issues?
Yeah.
That was the leadership component.
Yes. Yeah. Um, as a quick aside, and it made me think of this, growing up American, and first off, the way that you're taught about justice, I had a very naive sense of justice, right? I went on a mission trip to Cambodia, and I'm talking to the missionary there. He was the first Westerner to go into Cambodia after the Pol Pot regime fell. And he was talking to me about bribing police officers, because that's just what you do. And so they'll pull you over for speeding, whether you're speeding or not. And if they see you're a Westerner, the first thing they do is they, like, I think it's like $5 at the time. It was like $5 in American, and they'd be like $60 American. And he said, no, I'm from here. I'm not paying that much. And so they would argue about
Yeah,
the size of the bribe and bring it down to $20, $30.
right.
And there was part of me that was like, I couldn't see a way out where you shouldn't pay the bribe, but there was also part of me that's like, it's wrong. You shouldn't pay bribes, right? But there was no, I mean, what's he going to do? He's going to take on the whole police force, Dirty Harry style, like, like that American fantasy of like corrupt cops taken out by one lone hero, right? And you just start to realize, like, oh, you have to accommodate, right? Like, you don't have the corruption above you is not something you have control over. And that this was really helpful to think about this kind of techno feudal, like return to like multiple centers of power was
Yeah,
really, it helped me reinterpret even that. I mean, I made my peace with that, and it didn't bother me at the time. It was just one of those things where I had to like sit and think. I was like, what do you do if you don't pay the bribe? It's like, I guess you just pay the bribe and you argue with police officers about how much extra you're going to pay in the speeding ticket, right? Because you're a Westerner.
right.
But forgive me, that was just like, that was something that I found really helpful going through your book. But I did want to ask a follow-up question on the hospital. You talk a lot about Locke's conception of the body as a
Yeah.
defense, and you kind of compare and contrast that with I think Aquinas's. I
Mm,
think you were talking about Aquinas talking about natural law, and
mm,
Locke talking about natural right.
mm.
And you say that the contrast is the subtle distinction between those two. Can you talk about? And this is where I think for our audience, as they're thinking about your book, we don't have time to go through. I think it's 14 different examples or something like maybe
Right,
10 different examples.
right.
And each time you take an example and then you introduce with it a theorist. And so for embodiment, you talk about Locke, but you compare and contrast him with Aquinas. Can you talk about that distinction between natural right and natural law?
Yeah, so the structure of the book is that each chapter deals with one classic kind of crime. So pirates, counterfeiters, uh, espionage, right? So, and then I plug in a philosopher. And so the Locke chapter dealt with hospitals and red markets, so the trade in body parts, which can be quite legitimate, right? So I give this example, right, that when surgeons meet at these enormous conventions, orthopedic surgeons, I don't know how many there are in America, right? But I don't know, let's say 20,000. And that might be understating it. Well, they need body parts to talk to each other about. Hey, look at this bone, and here's what we want to do with this one, right? Well, there are companies that are all about how do you get body parts to hotels when the orthopedic surgeons are turning up, right?
Yeah.
There are people whose job that is, right? So Locke comes to mind, right? Because Locke famously made this argument that the personal rights begins with your control of your body. And um, red markets goes to this question. A lot of the great questions of bioethics goes to, well, wait, who's actually in control of this body, right? So this is when you get those great sort of ethical problems of the state takes over the parental rights of a particular patient, maybe a child, right? Because the hospital has reported the parents. You've been going through this in a sense, right? With your
Yes.
doctor, right? But parents get reported that look, the child's interest not being served here, right? So Locke is really kind of ground zero for philosophical reflection on this problem about how do rights sort of flow from the body. But in a but Locke stands at the sort of the threshold of modernity. But in an older tradition, the Thomistic Thomas Aquinas tradition coming out of the Middle Ages, you have less of the body as the sort of center of right. And you've got this more sort of cosmic account where everything has its place in a kind of global understanding. And we all of us are so very modern in that we immediately also sort of think of individual rights and that's a lot to do with this character John Locke, right, writing in the 17th century. So one of the points I just wanted to make was that once you're inside of modernity, the anxieties about what happens to the individual body just go through the roof, right? Because the individual body has become so, as it were, almost sacrosanct, right? Whereas in the Thomistic model, the natural law model. It's more the sort of the cosmos is the bearer of fundamental value. By the time you get to someone like John Locke, it's part of that sort of liberal individual tradition that it's the discrete individual that's the bearer of value. So I just wanted to sort of point out that, well,
Yeah.
that's going to lead to this sort of super anxiety around the fate of body parts and how we think about that. And, that was the kind of the broad point. And just by way
Yes.
of setting up,
Yes.
hospital management has to understand that they really are in charge of managing this kind of the ground zero of our sense of dignity, which is to do with the body, and then talk about the liminal space of the body, the possibility of bodily pollution, the idea of illegalities entering into how the body is rebuilt or even disposed of, and so on.
And so it's where, yeah, that's a, I don't want to take the whole time on the one case. There's it's so much there. It's so good. Thank you for that answer. One chapter I really wanted to ask you about as well, and I believe it's and I'm going to say his name wrong.
Yeah, Herzinger.
Huizinga and the
Yeah.
robbers. That's the section on play, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that one was particularly that in and I'm Bakunin. How do you say it?
Bakunin the anarchist. Yeah.
Bakunin anarchist.
Yeah.
Let's talk about and forgive me for enjoying this a little bit, but you're the guy representing conservative philosophy, right? You wrote
Okay.
The Wisdom of Our Ancestors,
Right.
and
Yeah.
I love that you're like, we're gonna have a chapter. These are all philosophers of the establishment. We're gonna have a chapter on Bakunin and on the anarchist. And I was like, oh, tell me a little bit about why you included him and what insights you see from a company gun running, like talking about organized crime being the good guys. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so you see, I wanted a kind of a foil, right? Which is we all of us. Personally, I think this is probably true, right? That the state is good. It functions. I think better to live no matter the problems in America, better to live in America than Syria, right? Where there's no government. But the anarchist, of course, their absolute axiom is governments are horrible. They do shocking things. And the worst of it is that we relinquish our own personal power. And so we make this Leviathan ever so powerful. We actually feed the beast that is actually here to corrupt us and abuse us. So you certainly have this, I would think, in a kind of a lot of both leftist politics, but also libertarian politics, right? I mean, so anarchism has two wings, right? It's got the left wing version. That's this Russian guy, Bakunin. He's probably the most famous. And then you've got the right wing version, the libertarian version, which is very popular in America. But they both of them think the state is not your friend. So I wanted to look at a case where we just assume that the state knows what it's doing, namely controlling the arms market. Who gets to make weapons? Who gets to sell them to make judgments about who these enormously powerful things should be given to? And we say, oh, the government. Well, the anarchist is like, what? You think the government has the interest of the common good when it's thinking about arms sales? Come on, right? I mean, so I wanted that represented, right? Because it's at least plausible. It's at least plausible that either the government is not very competent. All of us make jokes about the incompetence of government and politicians, or we think government's nefarious. And the whole Western political tradition would mock you and I if we said, oh no, government's never nefarious. I mean, from Plato onwards, the Western philosophical reflection has been power is real. Those who take it tend to want to do stuff with it to others, right? So that's kind of where the anarchist is coming from, right? That governments are not to be trusted. And then in that case, you get into sort of an interesting cases like, well, could you have a company run on anarchist principles, right? So anarchism, you tend to think of isolated individuals, but leftist anarchism is all about the collective. It's all about syndicates. So the idea of someone like Bakunin, who was writing in the 19th century, was the idea to have anarchist revolutions where the anarchists would be in charge of the businesses. So you could have an anarchist gun company. And then the question would be, who do they sell their weapons to, right? Because the anarchist position is not like we never make stuff, we never sell stuff, we don't engage in trade. No, 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 no. The idea is that, of course, we do, but then who owns it? Well, the workers own it, yeah, right?
Yeah.
So I then there was an interesting case again connected with Syria about some private persons wanting to send guns into the Syrian environment. It's very tribalistic, it's very ethnic. And so the philosophical question is, what would somebody like Bakunin say about um, an anarchist company that wanted to sort of, because there are some in Syria, there are some sort of anarchist collective type ethnic that have these long standing traditions of kind of collective action and collective living. Um, and so what would an anarchist want to do about that? And so they would be gun runners essentially, right? Because the governments would be against this, right? Because the governments want to control what's going on. But of course, the anarchist is just not going to accept the premise. So the premise of the book was that coming out of the Middle Ages, and this goes back to the earlier question about sort of the cosmic, right? So in
Yeah.
Aquinas, you've got a kind of a cosmology, and you've got God, a kind of a king, and then, well, the state, the terrestrial king, is sort of in charge of the common good, right? So the state deals with the common good, and the anarchist rejects that, right? That's the thing they go for. And so I just wanted that. Actually, at the midpoint of the book, I wanted that debate explicit.
Yeah.
Because you're always, when you write a book, you're always thinking about, well, who might read it? And would they even accept the operating assumptions? So I wanted
Right.
to have some sort of representation of people who'd be like, yeah, so for example, right, you can even just think of a classical American libertarian. Why should the government tell a company how to conduct its business? What's wrong with red markets? If somebody wants to make a trade of their organs with me, why not? Right? I mean, that's it, right? So you don't have to scratch the surface before you'll encounter philosophical positions, very cogent philosophical positions that are like there should be no restrictions on markets. If there are going to be restrictions, it should definitely not be the government that's restricting, right? So that raises then this question about, well, what does it mean for corporations to provide security? Right? Normally, the default position would be, no, no, that's for the government to do. But you don't have to go very far before you're like meeting philosophers who are, well, no, I mean, autonomous institutions can provide security. Of course they can.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of human history has operated that way. When you look at like that return to, I love that idea. I'd heard techno feudalism before, but I hadn't really looked into it, and it
Okay.
made so much sense when you're talking about polycentric. Some of this is probably because I've been reading German history, and and I was like, oh, this is exactly. I
Yeah.
hadn't seen the parallels until you started talking about it. About like, oh, you have a city state here, and you
Yeah.
have a little duchy here that lasts for 50 years, gets taken over, it's erased, and then it comes back with a slightly different name, slightly different borders, and it's like, how does the average person navigate this?
Yeah.
It's
No. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So Germany pre 1870 1870s, not that long ago,
right. Yeah.
was a polycentric order. You had literally hundreds of principalities, dukedoms. Actually, you go back even just a little bit further, and then you have principalities and dukedoms that were things like cardinals and bishops were in charge, you know?
Yeah.
Um, there's a reason, right, that Roman Catholic cardinals are called the princes of the church, right? Because they were once princes, right? So the of course, we've inherited a kind of a post World War II kind of model where, oh yeah, it's national governments
Right.
in charge, right? But yeah, no, your point about Germany pre 1870 is a fine example where you had all manner of small players generating security and stability. Um, and of course, in the German model, these were all, you know, aristocrats of a certain kind, right? And we can romanticize that. And in today's world, it's, yeah, kind of maybe not aristocrats, but would be aristocrats in a sense, right? I mean, power players who were angling for more and more territory. That because of course that's what these German princelings were back in the day. They were the strong men of their day, and then ultimately they get given titles and they sponsor Mozart and what have you, and they take on a patina of respectability. But this is a point that David Hume makes, right? David Hume says you should never do too much history because when you do, you will discover the dark reality of what you take to be good,
Yeah.
right? And this is his point then about how it is that we sort of how it is that we give allegiance to our nations. It's not because they're good, because a brief encounter with the history of our nations would show they're not good,
Yeah.
right? So this is the same with aristocratic order pre 1870 in Germany versus the sort of emerging techno feudalism aristocratic orders today, organized crime, cartels. This stuff is rough business. But if we think about the long history, you read Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars. It's always been a rough business.
Yeah.
And then the
Well,
question is, and the question of the book was, well, are there any ethical limits to that? Right? Because so some people who read the book when thinking about whether it should be published or not said, look, I don't kind of get the book because if governments aren't kind of telling us what to do, then there are no rules. It's just do whatever you want to do. It's just brute power. It's just justice, scare quotes, at the end of a barrel of a gun. So I try to give some examples early on that I just don't know if that's really true. I don't know if, and again, maybe goes back to your point about natural law in Aquinas, I don't know if it's true that in the absence of government, there are no rules. So Aristotle makes this point that politics is secondary to morals.
yeah.
We first think in terms of good and evil. And then we think in terms of, well, okay, what kind of regime is going to deliver the good and evil? So his point would be, well, in the absence of the regime, the state or the government or whatever, we've still got the problem of good and evil, right?
Yeah.
And I try to show there's a number of films that I think play on this idea, right? People. So I love the example I give of The Walking Dead,
That's
right?
the,
It's
I was,
very
yes.
cool.
You really
You
did
know,
a good job explaining this. I knew exactly where you're going, by the way.
Right,
So,
right,
yeah.
right. Well, I mean, I'll assume most people kind of, if they don't know The Walking Dead, they certainly know about zombie movies and
Yeah.
apocalypses,
Oh,
and but
I meant the moral. I meant the value of the moral language, and
oh,
not
right,
your
right, right,
example.
right.
The Walking Dead example was good too, but I just want you to know they came through loud
Right,
and
right,
clear that
right,
morality precedes the regime.
right. Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, just to say, the amongst a bunch of other examples. The Walking Dead was one example
Yeah.
of this idea that
Yes.
I don't. One part of the book was the effort to say that I think even in the absence of government, and the situation is more organized crime in and around government. You know, it's not an either or, right? It's that these contending polycentric orders, they rub shoulders with one another. But I still think the ethical questions remain dominant because I just think people. That's not to discount the utter barbarity that humans are capable of, but I do think that even cartels or whatever have their codes. You know, this maybe goes back to Herzinger, right? I give this one example.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, Herzinger has this argument, right, where he says, look, civilization is fundamentally about playing games. And I give this example of this one cartel boss killing his brother. And but he kills him, he invites him to the local cockfight. And while the cockfight is happening, the one brother kills the other brother. Well, why? I mean, why not just go to his house and kill him? No, it's got to be done at the cock ring, right? Because there's a whole symbolic play, power is being reestablished, and I need to be able to communicate to the people watching the cockfight that I have just killed my brother, so now I'm the cock of the walk,
Yeah.
right? So this is a very Herzinger idea, right? That that all social organization follows the structure of games. And then what's important about that? Games always have rules.
Yeah.
There are things you do, there are things you can't do. There are
Yes.
penalties that have got to be paid. So I wanted to use Herzinger to say that even in the absence of something like a formal legal or moral order, so even maybe inside a gang culture, there would actually still be something like a rudimentary structure of rules, do's and don'ts. So that was the role of the chapter on Herzinger, where he goes in. He was a Dutch writer writing in the 1930s, and he wrote this classic work called Homo Ludens, The Playing Man. It's my favorite book. I mean, it's a brilliant book. It's relatively short. It's just full of, he goes through opera, ballet, uh, anthropological studies. It's a really brilliant piece of work. And he just kind of lays out the ways in which order is played out,
Yeah.
where it always has a game structure. And
Yeah.
it's a super convincing book, I think. So that's that section.
Yeah. I think too of uh, when we look at sports, right? There's different layers. My dad works with college level and even NBA level basketball players. And so one of the things we had talked about, and he wasn't judging this at all, but when you first teach your kids, you're like, oh, don't lie to the refs if the ball goes out, teaching them to be honest. And he's like, when I talk to NBA players, it's like, I have a lot of respect for this guy, but he lies to the refs every single time. He's always like, oh, it's off this guy. And he's playing a different game, really,
Yeah,
right?
right,
Right.
right, right,
But
right.
but then you have the death of sport, which is, oh, I'm going to go hit my rival in the shin with a crowbar. I can't remember her name, but the ice skater, right? You're like,
Okay, yeah,
right.
yeah.
And then it's like, okay, it's so interesting to see the levels. And then it's like, okay, we're playing a totally different game. It almost doesn't feel like a game anymore
Right,
now when we're like there's it's okay to do steroids, right? There, like, that was
right,
for one group of people that wasn't okay. For certain for pretty much all of pro baseball for 10, 15 years, it seems that was
right.
okay, right?
Yeah,
But then that's very different from, oh, I'm going to like hire someone to actually sabotage the other team, right?
yeah,
And so, anyways,
yeah.
it's interesting to see
Right,
those. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah.
Sorry.
So the Herzinger the base of the Herzinger would be pre-governments. We play games. Games have rules. That brings us to the ethical world. And these rules are often also aesthetic. So that goes to the point that my pushback against those who would say, look, in the absence of government, there is no law, there are no rules, companies can do whatever they want. No, no, companies have all got to play games. What they can't do, says Herzinger, is be the spoil sport, because we all hate spoil sports. So, yeah, you could be a spoil sport, but Herzinger says, trust me, people are going to hate on you bad. And you don't
Yes.
want that. You don't, right? So this is it, right? So professional sports people, they'll cheat, right? But they cheat within the context of the game.
Yes.
And they'll take the penalty, right? A classic example, right, is in soccer, right, where sometimes players will simply grab the ball. They think the ball's going to go in the net. They grab the ball. So that's a penalty.
Yep.
They get sent off, but maybe their side still wins.
Yeah.
Because maybe the person who will take the penalty is going to miss. And there have been some cases, even in the World Cup, where that has happened.
Yeah.
Right. So I consciously cheated. We paid the penalty and we got away with it. And that's part of the nature of games as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's all super kind of control.
Yes. By the culture of it, rather than
exactly.
even, I mean, eventually we develop these kind of governing bodies, but really, there's so much power in the cultural side of it.
Yep.
Right. And if a government ignores that for too long, and I think you kind of get into that with, is it Petraeus?
Petraeus, yeah.
Yes. Like the perception of legitimacy is important.
Yeah.
But I want to be respectful of your time. And the last kind of, before I kind of ask that, like, what should someone take away from this besides reading your excellent book? I wanted to ask you switch from polycentric to polyhedral. And what does it mean that we should look at the world as polyhedral rather than polycentric?
Yeah. Well, at the end of the book, I just wanted to try to maybe provide a kind of an overarching way that we could think about, so that I think it would be a mistake, especially for people in the West, to say, it's our way or the highway, right? So more or less, this is the moment geopolitically that we're in at the moment, right? The Western world has sort of been in charge for quite a while now, and that's starting to break down for a whole bunch of very complicated reasons. And we could be nostalgic about that. We could regret that, but we might also sort of welcome the move towards a kind of a polycentric world. As you point out, until 1870 in Germany, that was the way of the world, right? So it's this moment that we lived where the state was in charge, was a kind of a moment in history. And then the question would be, well, how can we think about this positively? And I kind of then draw upon this polyhedral idea. You find this in Pope Francis, who recently died, but he kind of gets it from this French philosopher, Michel Foucault, who was no friend of the religious orders or anything like that. He's quite an interesting, this way interesting, right? Concepts often have histories, right? And they can switch sides, sort of thing, right? But the polyhedral is just this idea that we could have a sort of, this could be a really big issue for America, right? I mean, what is America really going to do about the cartels? I mean, there's some fantasies about going to war against the cartels. Maybe there's another way to think about it, which is you make some concessions. Are these people good people? Are they nice people? No. But you make some concessions, you rub shoulders with them. You don't like rubbing shoulders with them. You hold your nose a bit. You're on your guard. You're a bit, but you find a way to get along. And that was the idea at the end, this polyhedral idea. And then I point out that there have actually been some examples, like, for example, the Republic of Venice, which lasted 1,000 years, was right, because what's important about Venice, right? It's the height of aesthetics and music and art, but they had a very sort of say polyhedral understanding of the world. That principles of order come in all shapes and sizes. We're going to make do. We're going to be willing to make deals with multiple actors. We don't particularly admire them, or we certainly don't want them in our cities, but we'll make deals, right? So that was the idea, right? That the just to provide a certain maybe theoretical image of
Yeah.
a way to to morally make do. So the point would be that you would grant that order generating institutions, companies, cartels, or whatever, kind of in line with Herzinger, they are generating order. And there are rules, and those rules can benefit many. The point I think about playing games, right, would be that they're not tyrannical, right? There's a kind of a place, and you maybe don't get to play. Maybe you're just one of the spectators, right? But you're still participating, right? You're not one of the stars, but you're still participating. And then, of course, what sports fans do, right? They take that into their own lives, right?
Mhm.
And their friends, and they talk about it, and right. And so I just wanted to kind of end with an image where um, living with this polycentric order might still have a moral validity to it, even though our intuition in the West would be, well, moral is the state in charge of the common good, right? And the whole book was kind of wanting to play with that idea and to say, well, is that even the reality? Is it even philosophically justifiable? And if it isn't, what's the upshot of that morally?
Yeah.
So the book's not like, well, let's engage in moral nihilism. It's not that, right? The idea is to provide a moral frame for thinking about, if you like, events at the margins, or what we would think of as the margins of respectability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's really good, and I think you've already given a pretty good answer to this, but maybe you could narrow it down. Besides reading your book, and I really did enjoy digging into it. I enjoyed um, all the different ways that we can look at, I mean, and just bringing to light so many issues. What was it? 2.3, $2.4 billion of drugs seized in Antwerp. You don't have just like, it's just
Yeah, yeah,
mind
yeah, yeah.
boggling, right? You're like, I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't live in this world. I don't think about this stuff.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
then and
yeah.
then thinking about the ethics of living somewhere where your security services are provided by a company, right? Like all this stuff is so helpful. But besides reading the book, what is something that you would tell our audience after listening to us for about an hour now? Something you should think about, or something you should do over the course of the next week after listening?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, actually, right? Because it's sort of like, it's often what pastors do in sermons, right? They say, well, week ahead, think about this, right? So I suppose, right, what I would suggest to people is, if you think it's the government that's constantly delivering good order, just in your own life for 1 week, just ponder all the occasions where you see good order happening without the state. One example in the American context might be a four-way stop,
Mm.
right? Where the persons, especially those ambiguous moments when like four cars all arrive at the same time, and then everyone's like, wait a minute, what's the rule? Who goes first, right? Or where you got a stream of traffic, and I think the American rule is more or less, you let one person in, you've done your civic duty, but you don't let three in because the people behind you get enraged, right? So there are all of these subtle ways in which order is constituted, and the government's not actually involved. And then maybe you could be thinking about examples where that you might read about, whether a company being involved in delivering order, and then you can sort of ponder like, oh, well, wait a minute. I mean, that'd be so bad, or if it is, like, what would be my expectations about how they would behave? So that'd be maybe a kind of a grassroots version of the book would
Yeah.
be, how do I observe order being constituted in my own community?
Yeah. Yeah, what are the different because we do kind of think of it in this like singular surface of
Yeah,
authority
yeah,
and
exactly.
order, and it's multiple polyhedral. You know, like you have so many ways that good order is made in your life. I
Yeah.
I love it, Dr. McAleer. It's always a joy to have you on. Thank you.
Thanks, PJ. Really, really appreciate your questions. Thanks. And the opportunity. Thank you.